What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, it's the Game Week 9 preview. So I'm going to go through some quotes from Mikel Arteta and Pep Guardiola first of all. Then I'm going to answer a bunch of your questions, which will hopefully help your decisions as we get close to that deadline on Friday. And by the way, it is a Friday deadline this week, 6:30 p.m. UK time. So don't forget to make your transfers if you're making any before that. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button. Let's get into it. So let's start with some quotes that came out from Pep Guardiola yesterday. Man City do have a Champions League game tonight on Wednesday, so we'll see who starts that game, what minutes the players get, and that will hopefully give us some indication of who's going to start on the weekend, and we can reassess that in Friday's video. But because so many people are looking to bring in Man City players ahead of Southampton at home, I wanted to talk about these quotes now. So first one, Josko Vardiol cannot play all the games every 3 days. That's why we need Nathan Ake. Otherwise, we cannot compete until the end. So, unsurprisingly, probably, when Ake gets fit, he is going to provide competition to Vardiol for that left-back spot. I stand by what I said yesterday. I think even with Ake fit, Vardiol will absolutely be first choice and start the majority of games. But I also said in that video, you can't guarantee that he's going to start every single game. And with Man City players outside of probably Erling Haaland, you either take that risk or you don't. Are you prepared to bring in a player that might not start every game? If not, don't buy him. If you are, because Man City are one of the best defences in the league, they got Southampton at home this week, and obviously you can go through with it. But I would definitely wait until you see the match tonight. Because if Vardiol starts and gets like 70, 75 minutes, and then Ake comes on, starting to build up that match fitness, then they got a pretty easy game on paper, at least against Southampton at the weekend. Could Ake then start? That's the kind of thoughts that will start going through people's heads. So I would wait until you see tonight's game before you bring Vardiol in. At this point, he can't go up in price until tonight anyway after that match. But as we know, Vardiol not completely nailed, but I do think he'll start the majority of games. Like he should start, I would say at least 4, possibly 5 in every 6 matches, something like that. On Kevin De Bruyne, he said, no, it's not a big issue, but he doesn't feel completely fine. And Kevin is not 22 years old anymore. He has to be fit for his football. He has to be completely fit, and he doesn't feel comfortable at all. So he cannot express his incredible potential at his best. So that's why he's training a little bit better, but still he doesn't feel. And then, I don't know, there's just ... after that. He said to me, still I don't feel good. So if you don't feel good, take your time. So I did see another quote, which I can't remember if it's on the second line. Let me just double check here. Yeah, there was some other quote which I saw on Twitter yesterday that apart from Oscar Bob and Rodri, everybody is in training. So it's not like Kevin De Bruyne is far off, but he's obviously not feeling good enough to start at the moment. So hopefully that is a good indication of Foden starting. But as we saw last week, that is also not a guarantee because he can play the likes of Doku, Savinho on the wings, and then Gundogan, Bernardo Silva central. So again, I think I stand by what I said about Foden. If you've got him, you've got to keep him for Southampton at home and hope that he starts. If you don't have him, you could go for a short-term pump, but I'd much rather spend a little bit extra money and get Son if you've got it, because he's guaranteed to start. The second lot of quotes on Phil Foden. He feels much better. The minutes he played in the last game, for example, Phil, you realise immediately when he is happy and fit and mentally in the right moment, you realise immediately he is getting better and better. And he has had some issues this season getting up to full fitness. So that's part of the reason he hasn't had as good minutes as we saw last year. I think at some point, especially the longer that De Bruyne is out, Foden will be in that team. Right? I actually looked at the amount of starts he got last year and kind of forgot just how many there were. He started so many matches in the Premier League. I think that could happen again, but it's a case of when. Does that start this week? Does it start in game week 10, 11? And that is why I just feel like he's a bit of a headache right now. And for, like I say, for not much more money, you go and get a premium like Son, Saka if he's available at some point, etc. I just feel like Foden's a little bit too much money when you compare the value you can get elsewhere. It's not that what FPL priced him at is wrong, but I just think there's better value elsewhere. But if I had him, I'd keep him for Southampton. And then on Kyle Walker, he said he's suffering from a knee issue after the international break. Pep Guardiola unable to provide a time frame on his return, and he's been ruled out of the Champions League game. So that's pretty good news for Rico Lewis minutes. But again, the other quote I saw had Walker in training, so it might not be that he's out for a long time. But while he is out, that's good news for Rico Lewis. At some point, Pep Guardiola could just play a centre-back at right-back. We've seen that before. Akanji could play in that role. John Stones could invert into midfield instead of Rico Lewis. It doesn't guarantee Lewis's minutes, but it's definitely a positive sign over the next few weeks, hopefully. So Arsenal had their Champions League game last night, so we've got some post-match quotes from Mikel Arteta. For anyone that didn't see the game, Trossard took a penalty and missed it in that match, and Arteta was asked about the penalty situation. He said Bukayo and Martin are the usual takers, so Saka and Odegaard. Then after that, we have 2 or 3 that can take it. So I thought, and I think I mentioned this on yesterday's video, that Havertz would be next in line, but obviously not because Trossard has taken it ahead of him. But given that he's just missed, if Odegaard and Saka aren't on the pitch this weekend, I'm going to assume that Havertz takes the next one. So possibly good news for any Havertz owners if they get a penalty against Liverpool, which I guess is quite unlikely. I think it's a very minor thing to be thinking about because as soon as Saka is back, he'll be first choice anyway. So I wouldn't put too much thought into it. Ben White, I think, came off at half-time. It looked like it was just tactical. Arteta said he had a yellow card. We played a lot with 10 men in the recent periods. I didn't want to take any chances. Calafiori went off with an injury. I saw some people saying that it might be a knee injury, although I don't have confirmation on that. Arteta said he felt something, so he had to come off. A bit of a worry. Now, there's probably not a huge amount of Calafiori owners watching this, but if you are, the problem you've got now is you're not likely to get a good enough update from Arteta about whether or not he's available. And even if he says he is, you're not going to completely trust it. So I think he's possibly one to... It depends on what your squad is looking like. It's a bit like Saliba, right? If you've got 3 other good defenders that you could just play this week or have to come off the bench if Calafiori doesn't play, then great. Otherwise, maybe with the fixtures they've got, you could look to move him on. It's really difficult for me to say what to do because obviously we don't have the info and we're probably not going to get it ahead of the weekend. But not ideal that he has gone off with an injury. And then the big player that everyone wants to know about is Saka. And Arteta was asked about whether he'll be available for the Liverpool game this weekend because he wasn't in the squad whatsoever for the Champions League. He said, I don't know. He wasn't able to train yet, so that's unlikely. Now, this is the problem we have with Arteta from an FPL point of view, and it's exactly what I said on Friday. We're at the stage where what he says, we think the opposite. So on Friday, when he was quite positive about Saka, the initial thought is, okay, is that a bad thing then? Does that mean he's not going to play? Whereas now, he said he wasn't able to train, so that's unlikely that he'll be available. Does that actually mean that he will be available? And even if we think that's the case, that what he says it's the opposite, it doesn't feel logical to keep a player when a manager has said that he's unlikely to be available. It just doesn't make logical sense. So I think if you've still got Saka, it's a really tricky situation. Because it's a Friday deadline this week, I'll be recording final thoughts before the press conferences. So I'm not going to get to hear from Arteta again to kind of tell you what I think based on his next press conference. I just think if you're in any doubt, he's probably got to be sold. It's basically exactly the same as what I said last week. He's just too much money to have on the bench, and the fixtures aren't good enough to hold him through those doubts. Again, repeating myself a little bit, if the fixtures, in 9, 10, 11 were Leicester at home, Southampton at home, and Ipswich at home, or even something close to being that good, maybe you would take the risk. But it's Liverpool at home, Newcastle away, Chelsea away. They're not fixtures to fear for Saka, right? He's a really great player. We know that. But they're not good enough, I don't think, to hold him through the doubts, especially when Palmer's got Newcastle at home this week. Great option from 12 onwards in particular. And Son's got really good fixtures as well. So unless some news comes out from a journalist or something like that saying we think Saka's going to play or there's been really positive signs on Saka, by the deadline on Friday, I would lean more towards selling him. And I know I've said a lot of times that the fixture swing for Arsenal in 12 is pretty good, but it's not so good that Saka has to be in your team. If you get to 12 and you've got Palmer or Son instead, it's really not the end of the world. So I just think for that much money, unless we get something positive that's not from Arteta, by the way, because like I said, at this point, we're just not sure what to think, I'd probably lean more towards getting rid. All right, let's get into some of your questions. So is Chris Wood essential? No matter what people think he's overachieving, is it too late to bring him in, or can he continue and score like 20 to 25 goals? So on the first question, is Chris Wood essential? No, of course he's not. I don't think anyone is essential right now. Erling Haaland's about to play Southampton at home, And in some ways, he doesn't even feel essential for this week because of what's happened in the last few. So no, you don't have to bring Chris Wood in at all costs. But if you're looking for a cheap forward with the fixtures that Nottingham Forest have got, I think he's a pretty decent option. Like, he's already on 5 goals for this season in 8 matches. He started every single one. The minutes are pretty good. He doesn't play 90 minutes that often gets subbed early. But a lot of these games, it's 80 minutes plus. Awani, who, in pre-season, a lot of people were talking about how he's probably the better player. I don't think it matters when Chris Wood is scoring so many goals. Like, why would you take him out of the team? Forest are doing really well. So he's going to keep his place. You've got Leicester away, West Ham at home, Newcastle at home, next 3. As I said already this week, Arsenal away in 12 is tricky, but then you've got Ipswich at home. So 4 of the next 5 are decent. And if people are looking for a new cheap forward at 6.3 million, Chris Wood is a solid option. In terms of him overachieving and whether he can keep this up, if I look up the stats on Hub, as always, 7-day free trial, 30% off, links in the description below. Chris Wood is on 0.36 non-penalty expected goals per 90 this season, which is fine, right? It's nothing special, but he's scoring goals at 0.7 per 90. So he's doubling the amount of goals to expected goals. And you can turn around and say he's a good finisher. He's not that good, right? So that won't continue. I would say that the goals will drop down unless he starts getting more quality chances. But that doesn't mean he then suddenly becomes a bad option. You've got the number 9 in a good team with good fixtures who looks to be pretty much nailed on with good minutes. He will continue to get chances. I mean, the goal against... It wasn't the only chance he had against Crystal Palace, right? And he should have probably scored another goal in that game. The goal he did score was a massive mistake by Henderson. Like, another goalkeeper would have saved that, so it was poor. But overall, like, his numbers are pretty good. And even if you go back to last season, like last year he put up 0.58 non-penalty expected goals per 90. He played 31 times. 20 of those were starts. So it's not it's not that much of a small sample size, and the numbers were excellent. So that's what I'm saying. It might be 0.36 per 90 this year, but those numbers can go up as well as down. So I just think he's a solid option. I mean, there's that stat going around that since Nuno took over, I think only Haaland and Palmer have more goals than Chris Wood, which is kind of insane, right? Do I think that will keep up forever? No, of course not. But there's everything to say that he is just a good pick, at least in the short term for the next 5 game weeks. Because after that, let me just double check here. After the Ipswich game, it's then Man City away, Man United away, Villa at home. Like, Man United away, Villa at home. If you've got Chris Wood, you're not going to panic and have to sell him. It's really just the Arsenal and Man City away games in 12 and 14 that are a problem. So is he essential? No. Is he overachieving based on the current numbers this season? Yes, but that's a very small sample size. The numbers from previous seasons are very good. Is he going to get 20 to 25 goals? Probably not, but he doesn't need to do that to be worth 6.3 million. He's just a solid pick. So what do you think about a premium hokey cokey? I'm considering Salah to Palmer and then back to Salah over the next couple of weeks. Being able to save up to 5 free transfers makes this more feasible. So in general, I think it's a good idea to think about moving premiums around because they're the players that are going to score you the most points most of the time. They're also going to be the players that you look to for captaincy most weeks as well. So having the best players in when they've got good fixtures makes a lot of sense. On the 5 free transfers thing, a few people mentioned this in kind of similar questions. That is correct as long as you can get to the point where you can save that many transfers. Like, how many times have people already done that this season? Not very often. I've not got past 2 transfers yet. So it's all well and good saying that this strategy works because we can have X amount more free transfers, but it only matters if you can get to that point. And to get to that point, you've got to be happy with your enablers and be willing to stick with them for a while, even if they blank, right? So if you've got players in your team that haven't done that well, but have got good fixtures coming up, and then you're more cheap players, you've probably just got to hold your nerve and keep them so that you can keep building transfers elsewhere. So I think generally this looks to be, at the moment, the strategy that people should be looking at, because there are a few fixture swings over the next few weeks, and you want to make sure you've got those better players in. So for my team, for example, like Semenyo has just played Arsenal, although he had a really good chance in that game. He should have scored, by the way. You know, Villa away and Man City at home, not great. But I don't want to use a transfer on him because the fixtures afterwards are quite good, or at least they're not bad. And I want to focus my moves elsewhere. At some point, I've said about this before, I'm probably going to do Fernandes to Palmer But if I want to build up transfers before I do that, I've got to stick with him, even though he's only got 2 assists this year. You know, Morgan Rogers is a really cheap, solid option. He's just going to stay in my team. Calvert-Lewin, right? I've got him. Everyone probably thinks I should sell him, but the fixtures are good. He's cheap. I'm just going to keep hold of him and keep building those transfers elsewhere, or at least using my transfers on bigger moves instead. So generally, I think this is a good strategy. Just on the specific Salah to Palmer and back, I'm not quite convinced that's a good use of transfers. The only reason that I would do Salah to Palmer this week is if I was really struggling for captaincy. Because actually, if you look at Salah's fixtures, in 10, 11 and 12, like, people are going to consider bringing him in. I may even do like a Haaland to Salah switch in the short term just to get Salah for back-to-back home games against Brighton and Villa and then Southampton away in 12. Like, essentially, you'd be taking Salah out before Arsenal away just to get Palmer for Newcastle at home. Because after that, Palmer has Man United away, Arsenal at home. So you'd rather have Salah for the 2 home games. So I don't think that makes much sense. Like, if you've got maybe in Burma, I can see why people don't want to captain him. It's fair enough. Like, as good as he is, you don't see him like a Palmer and Salah level player, and that's absolutely fine and it is correct as well. You know, if you've got Watkins against Bournemouth, you know, Haaland is obviously a better captain. If you've got Palmer, well, you haven't got Palmer, you're thinking about bringing him in, but Son against Crystal Palace, etc. I would just rather not take Salah out because I know I'm going to want him back straight away. So I think premium hokey cokey is fine, but I want to do it for a few more fixtures than just one. But right now, and I said this last week or the week before, that does look to be the big strategy at the moment. Stick with those cheaper players and just hope for the best in the case of Calvert-Lewin and save those transfers for more important moves elsewhere. So nice and simple, is it time to give up on Dominic Solanke? And I think the answer depends on what you're going to do with him. If you're just going to use one transfer to move to another forward, I'm not convinced that is worth it. I think in most cases, I'd rather keep hold of Solanke and just roll the transfer instead, because the next 3 fixtures are pretty good for Spurs, as we've discussed with Son. Palace away, Villa at home, Ipswich at home. And then when you get to game week 12 for that Man City away game, that is not ideal on paper. And if you've got a spare transfer, maybe you get rid of him at that point. If not, and you get stuck with him, the fixtures afterwards are still pretty good. So I wouldn't consider Solanke a player to massively worry about. I also like the fact that Spurs create a lot of chances. If I just go to teams here and then goal threat. So for non-penalty expected goals, Liverpool are at the top, right? But Spurs are in the top 5, not far behind Arsenal. Also, by the way, Newcastle have done... That must be last year. Yeah, okay, I'm on last year's. I was going to say, Newcastle haven't been that good. If we go to this year, there we go. Spurs are at the top, right? 2.13 non-penalty expected goals per 90. No other team is above 2. So in second place, it's City at 1.84, 1.83 for Arsenal, 1.76 for Liverpool. I'm not going to go through the rest. You can go and check it out yourself. The Spurs are just a really good attacking team. And I know sometimes it's fun to kind of laugh at the fact they don't get clean sheets and stuff like that. But we're looking specifically at an attacker here. He is going to get chances. And on a personal level for him, if I just bring up Solanke himself. Okay, if I can just click players here. And then go to custom. Okay, and I'll bring in Solanke instead of Wood. Solanke's at 0.6 non-penalty expected goals per 90. That's really good, right? And let's not forget, although he hasn't had much bonus, he has scored in 2 of the last 4 and got an assist as well. Yeah, it's annoying that Spurs scored 4 goals against West Ham and he wasn't involved. And I know that Adam and Baker on Above Average FPL, which you can check out on YouTube and podcast, were saying that he's almost like Spurs Firmino. Not saying he's as good, but he's bringing the wingers into play, dropping deep and stuff like that. That might be the case, and that might be his role at Spurs. They would know way more than me, absolutely. But the numbers still look pretty good to me. And so I just think with the fixtures, there's no need to panic. If you're looking to sell Solanke to fund another move, that might be a bit different. So for example, for my team, if I could do Fernandes to Palmer and then Solanke to like a Chris Wood or, I don't know, a Cunha or someone like that, then I would probably do it. But for me, it only leaves 5.2 million in the bank. It's just not worth it, right? If I want Palmer, I've got to sell Trent instead. So maybe if it's part of a 2 transfer move where you're looking to get in a premium midfielder, I somewhat understand it. But even in that case, I wouldn't like to sell Solanke before the next 3. The numbers look good. The fixtures look good. Yeah, he's blanked against West Ham. Yes, he hasn't had much bonus, but I think he's still an okay pick. So who is the best Wolves forward to pick, Cunha or Strand Larsen? So let's take a look at both of them. In terms of starts, based on what we've seen so far this season, I don't think there's a massive issue with either of these players. Strand Larsen has started every single game so far. He's on 3 goals, 1 assist. And for Cunha, he didn't start in game week 1 against Arsenal, but he came into the season with a bit of a knock, so he was only able to make an appearance off the bench. And that probably explains why he only got 67 minutes against Chelsea in game week 2, because ever since then, he's played 90 minutes every match, apart from the Man City game in game week 8. But I think that was very much opposition related and how the game was going. I think against easier opposition, we will continue to see him play 90 minutes most games where he's fit. And he's got 3 goals. So minutes-wise, I think you probably give it just about to Cunha. Because although they've played very similar minutes this year, that is because Cunha had that injury at the start. Strand Larsen's only made it to 90 minutes in 2 games. Now, to be fair, he's also played 83, 85, 85 in 3 of the other matches. But you've also got 79 against City, 67 against Liverpool, 64 against Villa. He is more susceptible of being subbed off than Cunha, again, based on what we've seen so far. In terms of the numbers, for Cunha this year, he's sitting at 0.28 non-penalty expected goals per 90, 0.18 expected assists, which is okay. And for Strand Larsen, it is 0.22 non-penalty expected goals, 0.06 expected assists. So the minutes are probably better for Cunha, I would say. The numbers underlying are pretty good as well, or at least better than Strand Larsen. And Cunha is also way more likely, I would say, to be on penalties too. So if we're considering who's going to score the most points from now over this great fixture run that Wolves have got, it would have to be Cunha. But it's $1 million price difference. And so it's actually, I'm sort of on the fence about who is the better pick. Like, I think Cunha is the better pick. But I think if it's a case of, if I go for Strand Larsen, I can make this other big upgrade somewhere else, I'd probably just take Strand Larsen. So it's probably going to come down to how much Cunha affects the rest of your team. Like, I go back to that move I said just a minute ago, the Solanke to a cheap forward and Fernandes to Palmer. If I had 5.5 million to spend, I probably would just go to Strand Larsen and not rip my team apart to get Cunha in, even though I think Cunha is the better option. And there's lots of decisions like that, right? It's similar to the Brennan Johnson-Maddison one a couple of game weeks ago. Maddison, great option, really good numbers. But Brennan Johnson is just worth taking because of the cheaper price. So if money's not an issue, I would just go for Cunha. I think both of their starts look good, but his minutes are better and he's probably on penalties as well. But if money is a factor, I don't see Strand Larsen as being a completely terrible pick in comparison to Cunha. I actually think he's a pretty good pick. So who are the best 4.5 million-ish defenders? And I've got a list in front of me, and these players range from 4.3 up to 4.8 million. In terms of who the best one is, that does partly depend on how your team is set up and which other defenders you've got, because most of the time, you're not playing 4.5 million-ish defenders every single week. So, for example, I've got Lewis Dunk on this list, but if you had to play him every week, you probably wouldn't buy him because after Wolves at home this week, it's then Liverpool away and City at home, which is not great. But if you need someone for game week 9 and then you don't need them again until game week 12 onwards, when Brighton's fixtures get better, he is someone to consider, has a bit of goal threat, looks to be nailed on still as well. So part of this decision is going to come down to your own team setup, and you'll have to figure out which weeks you might need these particular players. Just to run through the players I've got on this list: Aitnuri, Pinnock, Mykolenko, Dunk, Colwill, Van der Ven, Moreno, and then Rico Lewis as well. There's probably some players I've missed. There's obviously players from the same teams as these options as well. So for Brentford, you could go for Collins instead, but I think Pinnock's got a bit more goal threat. With Nottingham Forest, if you want to go for an absolutely nailed-on fullback, or probably the one that is the most nailed on, I should say, it's probably Aina. But if Moreno is going to keep starting, I think he'll be more attacking in the long run. If you need a defender to come in, let's say you're selling Trent to fund a bigger move, for example, and you need to play them most weeks, then I would look more towards the players to the left of this list. So Aitnuri, Pinnock, and Mykolenko, because they've all got pretty good fixtures in front of them. So for Wolves, for example, okay, it's Brighton away this week, which is not great. Then you got 3 home games in the 4 games. 3 home games in the 4 game weeks after Brighton, which is Palace at home, Southampton at home, and Bournemouth at home. And in the middle of that is Fulham away. Then it's Everton away, West Ham away, Ipswich at home, Leicester away. So Aït-Nouri, especially given his goal threat, is someone you could just put in and play every single week as long as he's fit and available. So if you're looking for someone to play quite often, he's probably my top choice right now. I also like Ethan Pinnock. I've had him since game week 6 wildcard. You've just missed the Man United game, although obviously he scored in that one. Again, you've got 3 home games in the next 4. I'm going to get my numbers right eventually. 3 home games in the next 5 for Brentford. Oh my day, I can't. I've just lost it. We're close to the end of this recording now. I've just lost what I'm talking about. And they are Ipswich at home, Bournemouth at home, and Leicester at home. And the away games in between are Fulham and Everton. So not terrible at all. And as we've seen from the last couple of weeks, he's got that goal threat from corners. He's scored against, or set pieces in general. He scored against Wolves and Man United. So it's 2 goals this year, 2 goals last year. He got 3 goals the season before. There is some genuine goal threat there. And I've put Mykolenko on the list because Everton, decent enough defence. He's only 4.3, and that extra money could really come in handy later on. And they've got, let me just double check this, 3 home games in the next 6 against Fulham in 9, Brentford in 12, and Wolves in 14. And the away games are Southampton, West Ham, and Man United. So in the short term, I think they are the 3 that I would probably look at if you're mostly playing them every single week. Aït-Nouri, Pinnock, and Mykolenko. Like I said then, you would have to look at when you might need certain players. So Dunk, I quite like Brighton defence. I quite like Colwill as well at Chelsea. They've got Newcastle at home this week. Then it's Man United away, Arsenal at home. Not great. But from 12 onwards, the fixtures get really nice. So I'm not going to read through all the fixtures, but basically game week 12 to probably 22, the toughest games are probably Spurs away in 15 and Villa at home in 13. And I'm not saying that Chelsea will get clean sheets in all of those games, but Colwill is someone that you can play quite often. And so if you don't need them in the short term, he's definitely someone I would consider for the longer term. And then Van der Ven, although I don't think Spurs' defence is terrible, but they just always find a way to concede. But again, they got some pretty nice fixtures coming up. Ipswich at home in 11, Fulham at home in 13, Southampton away in 16, Bournemouth away in 14. There's some nice cover there. And then longer term, it's Wolves at home in 19. Bearing in mind these are cheap defenders, you don't want to keep moving them about. So you should be thinking a bit longer term than maybe with some of your other picks. And then Forest is just a solid defence with some pretty okay fixtures coming up. Leicester away this week, West Ham at home, Newcastle at home in 11, Ipswich at home in 13. After that, it gets a little bit rougher. But again, you need to think about how many games you need these players for. I had to put Rico Lewis on the list because of the Walker quote from Pep Guardiola. I still don't know whether I'd bring him in this week. Like, Southampton at home is great. I think the next 4 fixtures are tough for clean sheets, especially with no Rodri. Bournemouth, Brighton, Liverpool away from home in 10, 11 and 13. Spurs at home in 12. It's just not ideal. And you can't guarantee that after that, Rico Lewis will still be playing. I don't know. I've got him, right? So I feel like I can't sit here and say you shouldn't buy him. But again, to go back to the point I made just a minute ago, this is not a position you want to keep messing about with. You want to put a player in that is going to do you well for like 8 to 10 game weeks plus, if possible. Injuries can happen at any point. Suspensions can happen as well. But that's what I would be thinking about. And it goes back to the premium attacker question earlier. You don't want to be spending transfers on 4.5 million defenders when you want to make bigger moves elsewhere. So I would say Aït-Nouri, Pinnock, Mykolenko, short term, play them every week. They're probably your best options, at least for like the next 5-6 game weeks, maybe a little bit longer for Aït-Nouri. If you need someone this week and then longer term, I really like Colwill at Chelsea. So let's end with a slightly different question. Any advice for managing the disappointment of Arsenal's clean sheet wipeouts week after week? And you can apply this to anything that goes wrong in FPL or after a bad game week or something like that. I think it's worth trying to remember FPL is a game we spend a lot of time on because we enjoy it, but that time spent does not necessarily mean that you'll do better at the game. Because ultimately, once the matches start at the weekend, you've got no control over what happens. Whereas in other games, often the more time you spend, the better you will become. So I used to play World of Warcraft quite a lot. Surprise, surprise, the guy that talks about his fantasy football team for a living is a bit of a geek. And the more time I spend on that game, the better I will become. I can learn about my class, when to use certain spells, boss mechanics, etc. The same applies with FIFA. The more time I spend, the more games I will likely win. The further up the divisions I will go. I won't get right to the top, but I will get better at the game the more time I spend. Whether that's a good use of time is obviously up to everyone's individual opinion. But that's generally what happens in most games, right? In FPL, that's not necessarily always the case. I think you can definitely improve at the game. I think I've incorporated stats and stuff like that over the years. I never used to use that. I think that's definitely helped. And you can make good and bad decisions, but a lot of the time, the decisions are a lot closer than that, and the outcomes can be wildly different. So, for example, right, this week, I've got a captaincy decision, as we all do every game week. My best captain on paper, in my opinion, is clearly Haaland. That is a good decision to captain him. You can have an opinion that Mbeumo or Son should be captain instead, whatever, right? Haaland captain is not a terrible decision. It's a good decision. He might get injured after 1 minute. There's nothing I can do about that, right? I've got no control over whether Haaland gets through that game for 90 minutes, when he gets subbed off, how many shots he might miss, etc. And you've just got to be able to accept that, right? If I captain Gabriel, I think that's a bad decision this week. He's playing Liverpool. They haven't got Saliba. Not a high chance of a clean sheet, I would say. But he could get a clean sheet and he could score and get 3 bonus points and he's on a 15-pointer. And all of a sudden, he's done better than Haaland. But that wasn't a good decision. So I think all you can do is accept that you've got no control over what happens and just try and keep making good decisions. And also just acknowledge that sometimes close decisions will go badly. Like lots of people this week will take out Saka and they'll be thinking about Son or Palmer. And it's a close call over which one of those is best. It might come down to your transfer count and stuff like that. Palmer might go and get a hat-trick this week and Son might blank. Like those kind of things can happen. So to manage the disappointment, I mean, these kind of things apply outside of FPL. Go for a walk, forget about FPL for a while, get off social media and stuff like that. But while you're playing it over the next few weeks and the rest of the season, just accept that you can make good decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll always do well at the game. Like if you go back to just before game week 6 and you polled the entire FPL community over whether they thought Arsenal defenders were good specifically for game week 6 and 7, forget about the weeks after that, everyone would have said yes, or most people would have, because they're playing Leicester or Southampton. But they concede. These things can happen. So the best thing really is just to play it because you enjoy it and accept that it's not always going to go well, and do something that you enjoy instead, and forget about FPL every now and again. It's perfectly fine to do that. I'm not sure if that's actually helped, but that's how I try and think about it. There's just not much you can do once that deadline is gone. If you've enjoyed that video, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button, rate 5 stars if you're listening on podcasts. If you want to check out Fantasy Football Hub, links in the description below. Don't forget they've got a 7-day free trial and 30% off at the moment. Otherwise, I'll catch you tomorrow for team selection.